Hi, folks. Welcome to our weekly chat about local history. Thanks again for joining me. Rob Goller here. This week, I want to talk about something a topic that came up in a recent conversation about, I think it was because the weather is getting nicer and we're talking about things like baseball and outside entertainment activities, sports activities, golf, things like that, as the weather's getting nicer here in Western New York anyway. But it's hard to believe, but there was a time a time in our history when Sunday baseball was not allowed, and you couldn't even go to the movie theater on a Sunday. There were lots of activities that were prohibited on Sundays, and not just because the church said so, or a church said so, or a bunch of churches said so. It's because the law said so. Now, some of us who are still living today might be more familiar with certain so-called blue laws. We'll talk a little bit about why they're called that in a second. Why these blue laws, why they existed, but they existed in a format for most of us when it came to the sale of alcohol and when stores could be open. So there are some of us still around who remember when stores couldn't be open on Sunday mornings, certain stores, and certainly you couldn't buy alcohol on a Sunday completely, and in some cases you still can't buy alcohol Sunday mornings, and those are part of the blue laws. Now they're called blue laws because it is believed, because back in ancient times, or actually colonial times even, but they were the laws themselves were bound in books that were blue, so they called them blue laws, based off the color of the law books that they were contained in. But they started overseas and they got brought over here during the Puritan times. The Sunday laws, where in some cases, and you'll read about in the history books where the church actually ran the colonial towns. So the Puritans actually could require church attendance and not allowing certain activities on the Sabbath, the Christian Sabbath on Sunday. They could do that because the church law and the secular law were one and the same, the government. Those laws carried over into colonial times and into our United States of America. After the Revolution and we became the United States of America, those laws trickled into the law books even for the U.S. and in many states. So the laws were still on the books through the 1800s, and in many cases, the laws didn't just limit the sale of alcohol, but you couldn't even travel back in the old days. You couldn't travel was prohibited on the Sabbath. Some of the laws were loosened as the years went on, but into the late 1800s and early 1900s, it was still prohibited to do a lot of things on a Sunday. It was considered the day of rest. The Christians had a lot of lobbying force over the laws. So the Christian Sabbath was recognized in many places as the day of rest, and certain activities were not allowed. And you'd be surprised at what some of the activities were. Baseball, any sport activity actually, was prohibited on Sundays. Motion pictures and plays. You couldn't go see a movie in the early days, silent films, but couldn't go see a musical performance unless it was church related on a Sunday. And this was in the law. It wasn't just something you could choose as your religious belief. It was something that everyone had to abide by. So some of us remember laws that restricted the opening of stores on a Sunday. Well, expand that quite a bit. And that's what it was like 100 years ago, up until actually 1922. So what happened is these laws prohibited all these different things, but little by little, people were kind of uh, they were challenging the justification for the law. For instance, baseball was the big thing. Well, Major League Baseball came along. Baseball in a variety of towns came along, and it was a big money maker. And it also provided entertainment for people. So there was a lobbying effort to allow baseball on Sundays. And so New York State actually prohibited a lot of Sunday activities, including sale of alcohol, baseball, motion pictures. New York State had a law on the books that uh, prohibited those activities, among others, all across the state. Well, starting in early 1900s and then into the 1910s and World War I, there was an effort to repeal parts of these laws. So it took several years, but toward the end of after World War I, the state legislature and the governor signed a repeal of blue laws related to baseball and motion pictures. However, so the statewide ban was gone. However, each town and locality could vote to reimpose the law. So there was an effort among religious leaders of certain religious Christian groups to bring back the Sunday Sabbath laws, the Sunday blue laws. And they went town by town. And so in 1922, there was this big effort. It took a little time after the repeal and after World War I to bring this effort to towns um, across the state, and each town voted. So here in East Aurora, we had an election in March of 1922, and there was a big debate in the newspapers about whether we should get rid of these, if we should allow um, baseball and motion picture viewing on Sundays. And in some communities, they required baseball games could be allowed um, after like 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a Sunday, so people could still go to church. But here in East Aurora, there was a big debate about it, and it was quite interesting because you had the religious side that was saying that actually the motion pictures was more controversial than the baseball. Baseball, actually, one of the lawmakers who supported repealing the blue law said that young men playing baseball and community members watching baseball actually is better for the Sabbath because these young men who are playing baseball in these small town leagues, not necessarily just Major League Baseball, which there was money involved with that, in these small towns, if they're playing baseball, they're not off drinking, smoking, and doing God knows what else on a Sunday. So actually, the allowing baseball on a Sunday actually furthered the efforts of the religious folks who wanted a day of rest on a Sunday. And a lot of folks also brought up with baseball was that it's no different than going on a picnic with your family after church. It was family time. You could take your entire family to a baseball game. It served a religious Christian purpose watching baseball. Some people argued that. Motion pictures, on the other hand, a lot of religious leaders really didn't want that on Sundays because one actually said that it promoted rowdyism, watching movies on a Sunday. Yes, maybe it does, but picking out motion pictures was interesting. So Easter actually voted on this in March of 1922, and Sunday motion pictures were approved 456 to 308, so that was a pretty close one. So that effort on the religious side of things actually probably had an impact. But Sunday baseball was approved 555 to 215. So more people accepted Sunday baseball than they did motion pictures. Now, so according to the newspapers, Sunday baseball became a thing in East Aurora and Hamlin Park. They started having some Sunday games after it was on the books and allowed. However, Saturday still remained the more popular day for games. And folks were also saying that baseball players could play on Sunday because it was their day of rest and it was recreation for them, and they had to work other days. So young men who were playing baseball had to work other days, and Sunday was actually a great opportunity to allow them to play baseball. So that was one of the arguments there. Other towns followed suit. Some didn't allow baseball or motion pictures. So you had like little villages like Bolivar in Allegheny County, and down by the Hudson River. So each village and town was voting, and there were mixed results. But most towns and villages, and I've researched this topic. The reason I know so much about this is I wrote about this back in 2020, and this research will be part of an upcoming book that I'm working on, as you all know, of the book projects that I'm working on. I've mentioned them before. So a lot of this research comes from that a few years ago. And it was interesting that the topic came up in conversation recently with all the nice weather we're having. One of the things, though, that was interesting is that changing the law didn't really change a whole lot. It wasn't as drastic of a change as most people would think. Baseball was one thing, but the motion pictures, the theaters. I noticed this at what was the Millard Fillmore Theater in East Aurora, which was located next to where the Aurora Theater is today, and they had silent films. And I noticed in the newspaper here in East Aurora and in other small towns that theaters were having movies on Sundays even before the blue laws were repealed. And there was a loophole. I didn't discover this loophole until later, is that the law only prohibited a commercial motion picture activity. So the theaters would simply not charge for the movie. They would charge for refreshments or something else, but they wouldn't charge for the movie. So they weren't breaking the law by showing a movie. They would only be breaking the law if they charged for the movie. So there was a loophole there in the law. Just like today, people can find loopholes around almost anything. But once the law was repealed in 1922, they were allowed to charge for the movie, and we were allowed to have baseball on Sundays. Now, interestingly, this was only for baseball and motion pictures. And why did they carve out just those? Well, the baseball lobby was very strong in New York, in places like New York City. And what was happening is other states were repealing their laws, and New York was not, and some other states as well. And so we were at a disadvantage. One state would be at a disadvantage over another when it came to Major League Baseball and even the minor leagues, because you couldn't play baseball. The scheduling would get all messed up because they couldn't have games on Sundays in some states, including New York. So there was a real lobbying effort just for baseball. So things that were continued to be prohibited even after 1922, boxing. Believe it or not, boxing was a huge recreational activity, not just in big cities, but here in East Aurora, we had boxing matches in Hamlin Park as part of just regular entertainment. There'd be Fourth of July celebrations, and there'd be a series of boxing matches as part of it. But you couldn't do that on a Sunday. And you also probably a lot of times we talk about like the Fourth of July when it landed on a Sunday, they would move it to the fifth. Or the third because they didn't want to do it on Sunday. Well, they also probably couldn't have because many of the activities associated with the 4th of July before 1922 could not happen on a Sunday by law. So a baseball game or a boxing match could not happen. So in addition to not wanting to interrupt church services and other activities on a Sunday, if it landed on the 4th of July, legally it would have been half the events would have not been able to take place, considered entertainment. So bowling was considered separate too. There were certain towns the city. It took like till the 1950s to allow certain activities such as bowling on a Sunday. And some localities again didn't allow baseball or other recreational activities until after like 2 p.m. on a Sunday. So that would appease the religious crowd for Sunday morning, but still allow it in still allow it on a Sunday, but the churches would still be happy. Some cities, like going into the 1930s, one city, I think it was Newburgh, the fire department wanted to have show a motion picture in a tent to raise money for the fire department, and the city said no because it was a Sunday. So they didn't want to do that. 1937 is when bowling was allowed statewide, but you could each community could still outlaw it themselves on a Sunday. So even though the state got rid of its ban, each community could ban it themselves. And we don't have any record of them actually banning bowling on Sunday here locally. In 1949, football was allowed on a Sunday, basketball and soccer after 2 p.m. In New York State. So before that, a football game could not take place on a Sunday, even in a local town. And then stock car racing, circuses, hunting, and golf were lifted. Those bans, the Sunday Blue Laws, in 1952. So towns couldn't have any of those activities. A traveling circus could not perform on a Sunday before 1952. In 1973, horse races were allowed on Sunday. 1973. So these blue laws continued for a very long time. It seemed like some ancient thing, but these were around, and they were eliminated one by one as I think people realized, well, wait, if we're allowing baseball, why aren't we allowing football and all that? So um, uh, when we watch a Sunday football game, it's actually a treat because they wouldn't have been able to do that early on. And one of the things that really shocked me is that dancing remained illegal. And the reason it shocked me is because how you would ever enforce this. And in fact, in 1932, the town board here in East Aurora, the Aurora Town Board, adopted an ordinance to make sure that the local people were following the law, and that to make sure that you weren't dancing on a Sunday, churches, even churches that were having dances on a Saturday night, they would have to go get a permit from the town of Aurora. And this was on the books till recently. You had to get a dance license from the town, and you would have to write down when you were scheduling the dance, and it had to end before midnight on Sunday because they didn't allow it on Sundays. So dance classes, even they were concerned about dance classes counting as dancing. So that what got a problem with this was number one, the loopholes, whether you could charge for things, and if you didn't charge money, that it would somehow make you exempt from the law. But also, if you were dancing, like, you could just be dancing by yourself or with your spouse to some music, not formal dance, not charging to go into a party that had dancing at it, a wedding reception. Um, did that count? So there were so many gray areas of the blue law that it made it very difficult to enforce. And so a lot of times, even these laws that were still on the books till recently weren't enforced, and would be difficult to enforce because they conflicted with a lot of court precedent that had been set saying that people had freedom of expression, and the government had limited control as to the activities they could limit on a Sunday. Banning the sale of alcohol was one thing, but banning something like watching a baseball game or dancing was it was harder to do. It was just totally another thing. And so little by little, these laws came off the books. But it shocked me that some of these, it took till like the 1970s, 80s, even to the 1990s to take a lot of these blue laws off the books. How did this change how we lived in a small town? Well, today we take for granted that we can just go to the park and watch a football game, a Little Loop football or a high school football game up at the school. I don't know if they do Sunday games, but that you couldn't go to the movies on a Sunday afternoon matinee. A play over at Aurora Players would be banned on a Sunday. No Sunday matinee because you couldn't have entertainment, a performance. You couldn't go to a performance. So a lot of things that we do today on a Sunday were not allowed just 50 years ago in some cases, 100 years ago in many others. Life then, Sunday really was a quiet, quiet day, and stores were closed, and the religious Sabbath, the Christian Sabbath, was part of the law. And it's hard to imagine. We still have some of that today, but it's hard to imagine that so much of small town life would have revolved around a set of blue laws that restricted so many activities. And in many cases, these laws stayed on the books, and they just stayed on because they weren't challenged. I'm thinking some of the activities that were quote unquote decriminalized on a Sunday, that they only came about because it dawned on somebody, wait, this doesn't make sense. And still today we have some what we consider blue laws restricting activities on the books that were just part of boilerplate local zoning codes that ended up in these in local zoning codes that no longer pertain. I remember 20 years ago or so doing an article, research for an article in the newspaper about laws that were still on the books that made no sense. Like you couldn't hitch your horse to a tree on Main Street in East Aurora. Well, how many people have a horse that they're hitching to a tree? Since then, zoning codes have been updated, but some of these laws were still on the books, these archaic laws, and a lot of them, the blue laws, would have ended up in that category. And in many small towns, you may find these laws still on the books because simply for the fact that no one's looked at them in many, many years. So So these laws impacted a local life, and so when you're looking back and studying history, that perception of and that context to life, remembering how Sundays were back in the day when you're researching your family or what life was like, we have to remember that Sundays were much different 100, even 50 years ago. So when you're doing your research, keep that into context. All right, thanks for joining me again for this week's topic. Keep the topics coming. Again, a lot of times I think of these things as I'm talking to people out and about, either at the grocery store or at work. Again, I'm the town and village historian, but a lot of my research and this video project is separate from my official duties as town and village historian. Um, we'll see you next week. Thanks for tuning in. Again, these videos are also available on my YouTube channel, Robert Lowell Goller, if Facebook doesn't work for you. Again, comments can be made either in the comments, send me an email, or talk to me when you see me out and about. Thanks for keeping history alive, and we'll see you next time.